these truths to be self-evident.
That all men are created equal.
As a member of Congress, I get to have a lot of really interesting people in the office, experts on what they're talking about.
This is the podcast
for insights into the issues.
China, bioterrorism, Medicare for all, in-depth discussions.
Breaking it down into simple terms. We hold
these truths. We hold these truths.
With Dan Crenshaw.
The Eagle has landed.
Welcome back, everybody. Let's have a nice, non-controversial topic today. Just something that doesn't drive everybody crazy for once. Just something that's not super divisive and causes mayhem on our streets and protests at our Supreme Court, threats. So let's talk about abortion. Michael Knowles, you're here to talk to us about this super non-controversial issue. Thanks for being on.
That's my absolute pleasure. I'm glad we could be doing this from our respective offices, not from in front of the homes of Supreme Court justices or anywhere else, which now apparently, by the way, I don't know if you saw, but the next Supreme Court justice, Justice Ketanji Jackson, has refused to condemn those protests. So the next justice on the court, after this decision comes out one way or the other, is basically going in saying, I am willing to burn down the trust and reliability of one of the three branches of government for this issue. That's how uncontroversial it is.
Yeah, I'm going to talk about that for a second. Well, first, let's tell people why you're on the show today. We're going to talk about a really interesting documentary that you've recently made. It's called Choosing Death, The Legacy of Roe. Just came out on the Daily Wire, and it's anticipating the 50th anniversary of Roe v. Wade. I didn't even realize it is 50th anniversary. Wow. And now in this pretty historic moment where we may see it be overturned. So that's Michael Knowles, everybody. And of course, he's been on the show before. You know him. He has a great podcast, both his own podcast. He does The Verdict with Ted Cruz. And has written an amazing book called Reasons to Vote for Democrats. It's a very, very intellectual endeavor.
Scholarly.
Right. And now it's I'm blanking on the name of your other book.
Well, that one, who cares about that one? Just has words in it. That is called Speechless.
Speechless. Oh yeah.
You know,
well
I
named
figured
as well.
If I was going to do a book without any words, I wanted it to become, a #1 national bestseller. I stand by the thesis entirely, Reasons to Vote for Democrats. But then I figured if I'm going to write a book with words, I have to call it Speechless, right? And make it entirely about words. So that one came out as well. It's out in paperback next month, actually.
It was good. It was thoughtful. I like thoughtful books. I like people to think. And look, I also like good argumentation. You and I have talked about this. Look, it's easy to talk a bunch of shit on Twitter and own the libs, but as you say, you got to own the libs with purpose. And winning in politics means you have to persuade somebody. If your goal is not to persuade more people to your side, there's no point in you being in politics. A lot of people's goal in politics is to really corner the market on like a specific segment of their base that they know are passionate and loyal, because you can make money off of that. One of the reasons I always point people towards the Daily Wire or National Review or the Wall Street Journal is because I think there's a serious desire and a heartfelt desire to persuade people that we're actually right. And you would drive, and I think that's the direction of this documentary that you did, because you go through 4 lies that are laid out, and why each one of them is a lie. So do you just want to talk about each one of those, or do you want to give us some background on the documentary and what you guys have been working on? I'll let you take it.
Sure. I'm happy to. I'd sort of like to reserve all the lies as a little carrot for people to go over and watch the movie.
All right.
But what you focused on is the key here, which is a lot of times in politics, our disagreements derive from first principles, or our disagreements derive from different cultural values or ultimately religious views. Cardinal Manning famously said that all human conflict ultimately is theological. So we're talking about really, really fundamental places that we're starting from, and we can explore those things. Roe v. Wade is a little bit different, actually. The abortion issue is a little bit different. I'm not saying that first principles don't play a role here, but so much of the rancor around abortion comes not from a disagreement in values, but from a misrepresentation of facts. I mean, there are just simply basic facts here that we have to talk about: biological facts, moral facts, for that matter, political, legal facts that have been misrepresented by the pro-abortion movement. And so this documentary takes on what are lies. You know, the difference between a lie and a falsehood is that a falsehood might be made unintentionally, but a lie is intentional. And we know, just to use one example, one of the statistics that is cited for as one of the reasons as to why we might need legal abortion is we are told by the pro-abortion left that before Roe versus Wade was decided, every single year, thousands of women were dying from back alley abortions. That is just a lie. It was a lie concocted by NARAL, actually one of the founders of NARAL, the Abortion Rights League, later admitted that he plucked it out of thin air. His name is Bernard Nathanson. He was not only an abortion advocate, he performed abortions, and he later became a pro-life advocate and came clean on this. We know how many women died from back alley abortions the year before Roe. That year was 1972. It was 39 women. Not 39,000, not 3,900, not 390, it was 39 women. And actually 24 women died of legal abortions that year. And when you look even further, when you look at the number of states where abortion was legal and illegal, the likelihood of dying from an abortion was basically the same if you had a legal abortion or illegal abortion, or an illegal abortion. That was 50 years ago. Obviously, medical technology has advanced since then. Maternal mortality rates have decreased pretty significantly. So that would be just one example of, look, you're entitled to your opinion, but you're not entitled to your own facts. And then obviously the central lie when we're talking about abortion is the lie that the baby is not a baby, that the baby is somehow just a part of the mother or something more akin to a parasite or not human or not living. And that's just not true. The baby at the moment of conception is a human, is a distinct human, and has all of the characteristics that scientists have agreed upon as constituting life. So you could make the argument, as Naomi Wolf, a feminist, made in the 1990s, that in order for women to be truly equal, women need to have the right to kill their baby in all of its humanity. You could make that argument. I think it's a ghastly argument, but at least it's honest about the basic biological facts here. And so we want to at least establish those facts because this debate is not ending. It's actually just getting started with the overrule of Roe.
Yeah, I like your point about this distinction between disagreement on values and disagreement on the basic facts, because it's hard for them to make the case that we disagree on values because we're obviously for choice. I mean, just generally as a general rule, I think you should have as much choice as possible. Now, you don't have this inherent right to as much choice as possible because some of those choices might end up with a fist on my face, but you don't have a right to do that. Right. You know, we all agree that women should have equal rights. So they can't really make that argument. We agree that life should be protected. So what they have to do is twist the definition of life, as you indicated, or twist the definition of what a baby is. What are our best arguments on this one? You know, because they accuse us of being religious zealots a lot. But I think the pro-life movement's been very successful in, I think, examining the more human question of, look, is it a baby or is it not a baby? Because when you want it, you call it your baby. So just from a basic human understanding perspective, it's a baby. Like, we could talk about biology. You know, if we found a multicell organism on Mars, we would call it life. So why isn't this life? And then there's this whole like, well, it's not viable. You're not viable either, frankly, if I leave you out somewhere without the modern appliances for a few days. So, you know, like, what is this viability? So anyway, what do you think about all this?
Of course, and I think it's important to recognize that we're all religious zealots. Everybody is a religious zealot.
Everybody has a religion. I like that. True.
Everybody has a religion. You know, to quote that great political philosopher Bob Dylan, everybody's got to serve somebody. And so it's really jarring to me that people who believe that men can become women and who are arguing for mutilating the bodies of little kids are telling me to keep my religion out of the public square. You know, I think actually my religion is far more modest and far more reasonable than so many of the religious views on the left and on the pro-abortion side. And so you have to examine beyond the biology then all of the moral claims. I think what the pro-life movement is saying is that innocent human beings should not be killed at will. That's our moral argument. We're not even saying that you can't forfeit certain of your rights. You forfeit your rights to liberty when you commit crimes and are put in prison. And I defend capital punishment. I think you can forfeit your right to life. And I think that with due process, the civil authority has the right to end a life. I think you can forfeit your right to life when you engage in an unjust war, for instance. That would be an example that you're extremely familiar with. You know, when people have to go out and fight, doesn't mean we all have to be pacifists. But we're talking about an innocent little baby who has committed no crime and who has not had his rights to due process. And so what is the alternative argument here? I mean, if we all agree that the baby is human, if we all agree that the baby is alive, even if he's small, even if he isn't fully conscious or anything like that, then what is the alternative? Simply that if I have power over you, I have the right willy-nilly to take your life? I don't think so. I mean, that is so much of the argument now on the left is an argument purely from bodily autonomy, the idea that my body, my choice. And even if we acknowledge that the baby is a baby, well, the baby's in my body, and so I have the right to kill that baby. I don't think when we examine it in that kind of clarity, with the light of day coming in on it, I don't think anybody really agrees that we have the right to just kill people willy-nilly if that's our choice and are maximizing our autonomy. But that's why the left has to use all the euphemisms, such as reproductive health or women's rights or choice or decision, or, you know, they're using the euphemisms to hide the reality.
So, okay, so I'm going to skip going over each line of the documentary so that people will have to go watch it. But I do have some other questions. Who's Bernard Nathanson? Why is he significant to the original Roe decision?
Well, he's significant because he was one of the leaders, maybe the most prominent leader of the pro-abortion movement. This is a man who was, for much of his life, an unrepentant abortionist. NARAL continues to be, the Abortion Rights League continues to be one of the largest pro-abortion organizations in the country.
Okay.
And he supplied the political process. He supplied the courts with a lot of the misinformation. You know, we talk about misinformation so much today. Never before has there ever been such misinformation as we saw going into Roe versus Wade. So he matters. And when he comes over and converts, when he comes over and says, no, actually, I'm defending life now, his opinion carries some credibility and some authority because he was one of the leaders. Actually, when Jane Roe, Norma McCorvey, when she becomes a pro-life activist, the woman who was at the very heart of this case, when she changes her opinion, that's not the end of the discussion, but that should carry some weight with us, I think. And
I think so too.
There's one doctor we interview in the film, Dr. Hammond, who had performed 700 abortions. He was an obstetrician gynecologist. This was no big deal to him. He went in and did it. And the moment that changed his mind and changed his life was when he was performing an abortion and the baby kicked him. The baby kicked for his life. And he said at this moment, 700 abortions in, I knew in that very moment I could never do this again. And now he obviously is, you know, racked with regret, but he also recognizes that there is such a thing as repentance, there is such a thing as growth and change. And now he's a very prominent pro-life advocate.
That is, that really affects you, right? To think of that story. And I'm glad it affected him, because how many doctors do have the complete opposite reaction? It's not like he's the only one who's ever felt that. And you think about, Dan, even people today who, you know, I think Joe Rogan's opinion on abortion is probably the most common one, which is, I support a woman's right to choose and everything, but come on, guys, when a baby's a fully grown baby, you know, there's got obviously something wrong with that. And a lot of people feel that way because they want to support choice, but they don't want to be committing infanticide. And I have a great deal of sympathy for I actually have empathy for these people. I would have called myself pro-choice, certainly for my teenage years. It was really not until I had a conversation with a bioethicist, a female bioethicist, and I made my arguments for abortion. She shot all of them down. They were very shallow and stupid arguments. And that changed my mind. I hadn't seen the issue that way before. And so, you know, on this point of euphemisms, it actually ties into my book we were discussing earlier, Speechless. Yeah. We all use euphemisms. We use euphemisms because, well, in some cases, we want to sugarcoat reality. You know, there are harsh truths and we want to be a little polite. So we don't call a woman an old hag. We call her a woman of a certain age. This is not dishonest or deceptive. We're just sort of being polite. We're not lying.
right? But other euphemisms are dishonest. They are intended to deceive. When we call, let's say, an illegal alien an undocumented American, that's just a lie. That's dishonest.
Right.
The defining feature of an illegal alien is that person is not an American. And so people use these terms to confuse others. And the euphemisms run rampant in abortion. And you'll notice too, that the euphemisms are constantly changing. This is because I suspect of a phenomenon described by Steven Pinker at Harvard, which is called the euphemism treadmill. And that is when you are using a euphemism to describe a heinous act or something that is otherwise undesirable. Eventually the reality seeps in. Eventually people know what you're talking about, and then you have to change the euphemism again. So if the pro-abortion movement really thinks that they're on firm footing here, then why not be honest? Why not use the real terms? Why do you constantly have to say clump of cells or zygote or a woman's healthcare? You know, I call my grandmother up and I say, hey, Grandma, how you doing? And she doesn't say, well, you know, my hip hurts and my friend died, but at least I have my right to abortion. No, I don't think that's not what she means by women's health. Okay.
Right.
And that's not what anybody really means by that phrase.
Yeah. And like that, you're right. What Rogan says is probably by polling, we know that that's the general stance of Americans. You know, you get a very strong majority that thinks abortion should be prohibited after the first trimester. And then that drops off quite a bit, but before that. And of course, the question to someone who wants it to be legal in the first trimester or the first 6 weeks, whatever it is well, what's the difference between a fetus at 11 weeks and 13 weeks morally? I mean, what the value difference? Is there really that big of a delta between these two human beings? And it's, I just don't see how you can make that argument, and they can't, right? So it becomes an argument of convenience.
Well, here's what they say. That very often they'll say, well, the baby in the first trimester is not conscious. And you say, okay, so now you're saying consciousness is the determining factor as to whether or not you can kill someone. So am I permitted to kill someone while he's asleep? Am I permitted to kill someone who is in a coma? No, obviously not. Okay, there goes consciousness. Well,
isn't there a value to potential consciousness, right? Because of course, because we would say, well, you can pull the plug on somebody if they have zero chance of recovery, right? They're in a coma, they have zero chance. The family has the option to pull the cord. But if the doctors are like, but if the doctors are like, look, in a month, he's going to be good. I promise you this guy's waking up in a month. Just give him some time. Family's like, I don't know. I mean, we didn't really like him that much in the first place.
I got a tea time at noon, so sorry, we got to go. No, I don't think that's going to carry any weight. And then, so the next one they'll say, well, look, the baby in the third trimester, or, you know, maybe after birth, he's got his hands and his feet and his legs. First of all those features develop much earlier than the third trimester. But they'll say, look, he just looks like a human being, right? He's got his little nose and his eyes and his hands. And so you say, okay, so let's say that someone has a disability. I'm talking to a disabled veteran right now. Let's say someone is missing a body part. They lose a hand, they lose a finger, they lose, you know, some part of their body. Does that therefore entitle someone to kill that person because he doesn't have a hand, because he isn't quite as recognizably human? I don't think so. I don't think anyone would actually make that argument. So that argument goes out the wayside. And well, the baby in the first trimester, he's really, really small. All right. Does this mean we're now permitted to, you know, my 1-year-old kid is really small. Does that give me the right to kill him? I don't think so. No, none of those arguments hold up. And so your point is right. You know, I have a great deal of sympathy for the Joe Rogan argument here, and I think he's on the right track. And I think he's thinking about these things in the right way. But it's actually the least coherent argument of all. Either human life has some value, and if it has value, it has to have that value from the very beginning, or human life doesn't have any value. There were bioethicists, I think at Cambridge, some years ago, who came out with a paper and they said, look, abortion is totally morally acceptable because of X, Y, and Z criteria. And yes, that implies that you should be able to kill a baby after birth at 6 months or a year or 18 months. And we think that's totally fine. Yes. And so, you know, I guess there's some consistency there, but is anyone really going to embrace that argument? I don't think so.
Well, it seems to me the Democrats have embraced that more extreme view. I don't know if it's a result of the fact that it's so obvious, because you're right. It is the most incoherent. To have that middle ground is extremely incoherent. And maybe the Democrat Party realized this because now their party platform is, abortion on demand, paid for by taxpayers at any time during the pregnancy. I suppose that's a coherent argument if you deliver no value whatsoever to life. And this gets to some of their other arguments. I think the most honest they are is when it's just it's an argument about convenience, like, because they make these arguments with climate, and then the extremists make this argument with climate change too. I mean, how can we even bring a baby into this world? So they in multiple issues, not just this one, they attempt to devalue human life and paint human beings as this scourge on the earth, whether it's scourge on the earth or scourge on a community. Because that's the argument. Certainly the Margaret Sanger argument. I mean, how are they going to get away from that? How do they even work past that?
And there are actually two arguments in what you're describing. The one is this very anti-human view that we're this poison, this plague on the world, and actually the delta smelt and the trees would be better off without us, which, by the way, isn't true. Actually, the human beings are wonderful for conservation, but putting that aside, it's insane, right? The idea that the delta smelt has more value, that's not my view. I think that we should be good stewards of creation, but that it's here pretty much for us and for us to be good stewards of and for our enjoyment. But then there is this other argument, which is the argument from suffering. The one side is, how could you bring a baby into this world? That's so bad for the world. The other one is, how could you bring a baby into this world? The baby's going to suffer. The baby's unwanted, which is not true, by the way. Also, for every one infant, every one newborn baby that's put up for adoption in the United States, there are roughly 36 couples waiting to adopt a baby. So the idea that the baby's not wanted is just not true. But let's say the baby is going to be born into bad circumstances. He won't have all of the advantages that you might want. What that argument basically boils down to is that life is not worth suffering, that if you have some degree of suffering, that it would be better to be dead. And everyone goes through some suffering. Getting back to the point that you're a disabled veteran, you have pain, you have chronic pain. Would you rather not be here because you have some physical suffering? Or do you think life is actually worth living and actually suffering is an intrinsic part of life?
Well, that gets into a deeper conversation. And one I've had a couple of times recently on this podcast too, sort of the value of suffering as a necessity in life, as a thing that makes you stronger. There's these sort of untruths that people live by, and one of them was laid out really well in that book, The Coddling of the American Mind by Jonathan Haidt. One of those untruths was, what doesn't kill you makes you weaker. And so there's it's this belief that suffering, that hardship is not. It's not the norm, it's the exception. And it only happens because of injustice, usually because the oppression of someone else. And so demagogic politicians can really take advantage of this kind of victimhood narrative and then push it on people. And it's very compelling because human nature says, look, I don't want to believe that anything's my fault. I don't want to believe that this lot I drew in life has anything to do with me or my actions. I'd rather believe it has something to do with somebody else. And that's a really, it's very degrading. I think it removes agency from people, and it certainly traps them in this spiral of despair, which is counterintuitive when we're talking about suffering, I guess, right? But suffering is part of life, and it's how we look at it. And so I think one of the biggest threats
this is also, well, this is where it's also sort of a religious question again. I'm not using religion in some kind of narrow sectarian way. I'm talking about it in a broader way, which is that traditionally we've had the view that suffering can build character. Chin up, kid. Suffering is sanctifying, actually, that it's productive. The reason that we have that view, even people who are atheistic or agnostic in our culture, is because of Christianity, because Christianity animates Western civilization. And in the Christian religion, God so loved the world that he sent his only son to die so that those who believe in him could have everlasting life, right? The very act of salvation was Christ suffering, going through a passion, being scourged, being crowned with thorns, and then dying on a cross, and that suffering is redemptive, and that we can tie ourselves to that suffering, and it's sanctifying, and that builds us up. Now, even if you don't go to church and you don't believe in Christianity, that is very much the ethos, and that is very much the culture that we have traditionally lived in. The secular left has offered something that is completely the opposite. As you say, the left has said that whatever doesn't kill you makes you weaker, that suffering is awful. This is why the left pushes euthanasia, not just for very, very old terminally ill people, but we've already slid down that slippery slope. And now in Europe, you're seeing euthanasia of teenagers, euthanasia, quote unquote. We're talking about legal suicide and assisted suicide. You're seeing all sorts of, and you're seeing widespread abortion. Well, the real problem with that thought is because suffering is inherent in life, you are not going to avoid it. Nobody is born perfect. You know, sometimes people will say, well, I'll support abortion if the baby has a genetic problem, if the baby isn't perfect. I always ask them, are you perfect? You don't look perfect to me. Looks like, I think I'm not perfect. I've got some problems too. And so the logical conclusion of that suffering makes life no longer worth living, is that we all just kill ourselves, right? You know, because we're all going to suffer. Do we really want to live in that world? Well, I guess if we did want to live in that world, we wouldn't live for very long.
It does get to a much harder conversation about. So let's say we outlaw all abortions of convenience. You know, let's say Roe v. Wade gets overturned, and states, you know, more conservative states will definitely start with a heartbeat bill. We'll definitely start with outlawing these abortions of convenience. But then there does become harder questions that reveal themselves, you know, such as what if it's more than just a genetic defect? What if it's a seriously life-altering, painful, awful situation? You know, what if? And it gets to other questions. This is where the politics come into it, and they're going to get heated, right? It's going to be an interesting. I'm curious what your take on how this is going to look moving forward. You know, how the so-called exceptions are dealt with. Now, I think the exceptions are really just the exception, which is rape. When we say incest, I'm assuming we also mean rape.
Right.
When we say that, right? Like I don't know why that's always distinguished. Like it's anyway. And then the, you know, life of the mother, but that we never had a position where you let the mother die. Like that's never been our position. You know, we just say, look, you sometimes to save the life of the mother, you have to have a premature delivery. Just don't automatically kill the baby is all we're asking. Okay. Just if you can save the baby, save the baby.
That's so important, because getting back to this, you know, you're entitled to your opinions and values, but not to your facts. When we say abortions of convenience, it's not like we're talking 50-50 here or 60-40. We're talking about 99% plus of abortions are abortions of convenience.
Yep. It's a good point.
Instances of rape they always say rape, incest, or threat to the life of the mother. And I think you make a good argument that rape and incest, they're actually the same thing. You know, that's less than 1%. And also to your point, there is no problem during pregnancy for which the cure is abortion. The nearest that there is to such a complication in pregnancy is an ectopic pregnancy, where the baby implants in the fallopian tube. To get into the kind of technical moral argument here, this would be resolved through the principle of double effect, which is a principle articulated by Thomas Aquinas and has been in our culture for a very long time. That, for instance, if you went in to operate on the fallopian tube, to remove the fallopian tube or something like that, the consequence of that would be the death of the baby. But you're not going in and saying the abortion is the cure to this condition. And then when you're talking about other conditions that could pose some risk to the life of the mother, then you're complete. I mean, I'm giving you the absolute hardest case here. The rest, as you say, well, you can deliver the baby. This even gets to one of the most dishonest slogans from the pro-abortion left. They say, well, you pro-lifers are supporting forced birth. Do they understand how an abortion works? What do they think happens in an abortion? That the baby just vaporizes, vanishes into thin air? No, an abortion involves a birth as well. The only question is, are you giving birth to a living baby or to a dead baby? But you can't avoid that. And the reason they use that phrase is because they're denying the very fact of the baby, and they try to use very hard cases to do that. But I'm not denying that there are hard cases. I'm simply pointing out the obvious, which is that the baby is there whether you like it or not.
You brought up something else. I think it's unrelated to abortion for a variety of reasons, but I think it's a super interesting discussion on ethics and morality and politics, which was just the euthanasia comment you made. And, you know, do you get to choose to kill yourself? Can you make that choice? That's an interesting one, because like I think to myself, what if I'm old? I'm crapping myself every day. It's awful. I can't really think straight anymore. I can't talk. I can't do anything. I'm a complete burden. And I hate my existence. It's never going to get better, right? Because I'm just old. All my friends are dead. Why can't I choose that? It's an interesting ethical discussion. And you're the kind of guy who thinks deeply about things. So kind of curious what your take is.
I am strongly in the anti-euthanasia, anti-assisted suicide camp. But this actually does get down to a first principles kind of question, which is, do you have the right to do whatever you want with your own body? So the pro-abortion left tries to make this argument.
Yeah.
When we're talking about the baby's body,
they try, but
that doesn't make sense. It's preposterous when they do it. But let's take the baby out of it for a second and just ask the question: do you have the right to do whatever you want with your own body at any time? And I don't think that's true. In American history, that has never been the case. That's why we have drug laws, for instance. You might want to go shoot heroin. Well, in certain cities, you probably could right now. But as a national matter, you don't have some natural or even civil right to go shoot heroin. We as a political community have said there are certain things that you can't do with your own body. Suicide would be one of those things. You are not allowed to commit suicide. It's against the law. Now they're trying to repeal those laws. Coincidentally, I have a copy of Edmund Burke over here on my desk. Providential, perhaps, if not coincidental. And he has a great line, which I really like in here. He says, "Men have no right to what is not reasonable and to what is not for their benefit." So we in the political community, we might go and change some drug laws and say, okay, you can smoke pot now, but you can't do crystal meth. And we have the right to do that in self-government. But there is no natural right to do things that are not reasonable and not for our own benefit. It's contrary to the natural law. It's contrary to self-preservation. It's just wrong, And so if one were to be an arch libertarian and an arch individualist or something, you would probably come down on the side of it should be legal to kill yourself or legal to do any sorts of drugs or whatever. But if you're a conservative, or if you're more of an old school liberal, or if you're just a kind of a moderate person who has, goes along with the political tradition, you would probably refute that because people don't have that right. Lord Acton, who is a favorite of the libertarians, but I like him a lot too. He made this distinction between liberty and licentiousness. And he said, liberty is not the ability to do whatever you want, whenever you want to do it, but it's the right to do what you ought to do. And this gets into a little bit of an even deeper philosophical conversation. But it's even, what does it mean to want something? Let's go back to the heroin addict. I'm a heroin addict, let's say. I'm not, okay, I'm well behaved. But let's say I were a heroin addict.
As far as we know.
I want to do, yeah, as far as we know. If I were a heroin addict, I would want to do the heroin at a certain level. But I would also not want to do the heroin at a higher level, right? My appetite would say, give me the syringe. My higher rational will would say, I really wish I could get clean. I really would. And so the way we've understood that before our entire culture became completely philosophically ignorant and we stopped, having a real education, is we understood that as the lower will is the appetite. The higher will is the rational will, and the rational will mediates between the appetite and what you would call the divine will, the moral order, the eternal laws, right? The place from which we get our philosophy. That now has been inverted, and traditionally we've understood the appetite to be licentiousness and the higher will to be liberty. And our founding fathers were emphatic on this point. The founding fathers said, if you abuse liberty to licentiousness, if you confuse those two wills, you are going to lose your whole country. This is actually what St. Paul talks about when he's saying, the things I want to do, I don't do, and the things that I do want to do, the things that I do want to do, I don't do. And the things that I don't want to do, I do. There we go. It's very confusing. Right. That's what he's talking about. He's talking about a conflict in these wills. The whole point of liberal education, traditionally understood, is you tamp down all those bad appetites and you cultivate the higher will. It's the liberal arts. It's the arts of freedom. And that makes you a free citizen. As we lose that, we will be less capable of self-government. You're already seeing the fruits of that around you.
I agree with a lot of what you said. And John Paul II, or St. John Paul II for you Catholics, said something similar, right? It's freedom is not the right to do what you like, but to do what you ought, something like that. And it's a very similar vein there. And like that, I totally agree with that. Makes a lot of sense. And that's why I too is as much as I want to see the libertarian side of the drug issue, when it really comes down to it, the drugs, it's not just that it's this higher kind of good that you're striving for. That's true, but it's not very convincing to a lot of people who are libertarians. Like want to see that very practical argument. Well, the practical argument is you're a burden on yourself and your society. So in an indirect way, sometimes a very direct way, you are infringing on the rights of others, right? Which is, that's a very libertarian thing. You have the right to do whatever you want as long as you don't infringe on the rights of others. So that's a very libertarian tenet, and you could say drug use falls under that. The old age one, not sure. I think that's a tougher one. I think it's a tougher one because your higher self, also you're being kept alive at this point by artificial means.
Medicines
so it's, natural law would suggest I should have been dead at 35, just like everybody else the last few thousand years. It reminds me. Okay, let me. Can I tell you this really? Have you seen the Norseman? It's like a parody on Netflix of the Vikings.
No.
It's hilarious, and you should watch it. But the first episode, I mean, it's just really the parody is unbelievably good. But in the first episode, there's a Viking slave, and he's bringing all the old Vikings up to the top of a cliff because when they get to a certain age, they're supposed to jump off the cliff, right? Because it's because they're a burden on their society. And the first old Viking jumps off and he yells Valhalla, and he splats onto the rocks below. And all the other old Vikings look over and they're like, "Nah, I'm good. I'm not going to do that."
We're backing away from this. It does create.
It's so funny. You got to watch it.
I certainly do. I mean, because that actually is kind of my thinking on this issue a little bit. And the libertarians might appreciate one argument against euthanasia, which is incentives. And libertarians are very good at understanding incentives. And with to use exactly your language, Dan, you say, look, I'm going to be old. I simply will be a burden on my family, and I'm going to be drooling, and I'm just not going to be of any use to anybody. That's probably true. Now, if we set a cultural norm, a legal norm and a cultural norm, that when people get to a certain age and they're drooling and they're useless, they just kill themselves. That also creates an incentive to do that. That creates an expectation to do that. It creates a standard and a norm, which all
just like those have. Vikings. That's an interesting point.
That's right. And then it becomes a question of, look, when I'm 110 years old, I'm probably going to be pretty useless, and so okay, then I understand that. But what if someone is not 110? Let's say someone's 25 years old, but severely handicapped. He can't take himself to the bathroom. He can't go anywhere. Can't walk. Let's say he's got mental handicaps. Let's say he's severely mentally damaged, and he's aware enough to know that. He's aware enough to have that kind of despair. If the new line is when you're no longer useful to anybody or when you're a burden to other people that you off yourself, what's to stop that guy? I don't want to live in a world or a country in which our older people,
where it's just normalized,
disabilities, right, where they feel that they have to, where they feel that they're no good to anybody, that their value derives from some kind of just utilitarian kind of I'm doing this job for you. I'd prefer to live in the country where we recognize that people have all sorts of value, and people who are not producing, and people who are that there's still a great human value to them, and that they should not do that.
Yeah, it's a good argument. Gives people something to think about, I think. Back to the other non-controversial issue besides euthanasia, which is abortion.
The other side of death. At the beginning of the right.
Yeah, we're having a really good conversation today, Mike. This is great. Super uplifting. What do you think the political environment looks like for Republicans moving forward, assuming Roe v. Wade gets overturned? And well, we'll start with that, and then I have kind of a follow-up. But political environment, meaning, is this going to be a big issue for voters, you think, in November?
This will not be a big issue for voters. And in as much as it will be a big issue for voters, it will be a bigger issue for conservative voters, for pro-life voters, than for pro-abortion voters. I know this is a controversial or uncommon opinion, and I know that the prevailing consensus view is that abortion is a big winning issue for Democrats, and it's going to send them all to the polls in the midterms. And you've even heard this from the typical establishment media, and some establishment Republicans have feared. They said, "Oh gosh, I want to overrule Roe, but do we have to do it now? And now I'm going to lose my midterm election." I don't think that's the case. I think that whatever polling we have on this issue shows that it is relatively low on the totem pole for voters. It's not a single issue for very many voters, other than pro-lifers. And when you even just measure enthusiasm, I forget who put the poll out, it came out about a week or two ago. When you measure voter enthusiasm, it is true that the potential overruling of Roe has increased enthusiasm among Democrats, but it's increased enthusiasm by twice as much among Republicans. So if Democrats want to play out the political consequences of this, be my guest. I think it's a winning issue for Republicans.
Yeah, I tend to agree. I mean, it passed that pretty strict abortion law in Texas, and it was not overturned, still exists. And I don't hear a lot about it. You know, I don't see Abbott's polling numbers versus Beto would be the best indicator of whether it's really affecting anything. And it doesn't seem to be, but maybe that's just because Beto is so desperately unlikable. That could be it too.
Third time's the charm.
Yeah.
Fourth time's the charm.
There are a couple other things. Like Democrats have started to suggest that something like IVF would be illegal. Plan B would be illegal. What do you think of this? I think this is fear mongering. I think they've even said birth control would be made illegal. You know, how do we refute those arguments?
Well, that's all just completely false. I do oppose Plan B. I oppose IVF for that matter too, because IVF so often very often it entails abortion. It entails the creation of human life that one then puts on ice. It separates procreation from the marital act. I think there are lots of problems with IVF. I think there are a lot of problems with Plan B, in as much as Plan B can act as a contraceptive, but it's a little bit unclear, but it would appear that it can act as an abortion drug as well. It can prevent the implantation of an embryo that's formed. And then in terms of contraception, I mean, the only reason they're raising that is because they're so desperately trying to get away from the abortion issue. They're trying
because they don't. I think so. Because they don't have a lot.
Marriage.
They don't. Right. Oh yeah, that one was bizarre. Interracial marriage. Gay marriage. There was another one too that they were. I think it was just the right to even having contraception. I think that was another one. That was another sort of
case.
Right.
And they're making these arguments because obviously they know that abortion is a loser for them, so they're just trying to move on to something else. But the fact of the matter is that we've seen the leaked draft. This presumably liberal clerk on the court has leaked the draft of the opinion. We know what the opinion probably will do and what it will not do. There are two ways to overrule Roe. One way is to say the Constitution doesn't talk about abortion. Deal with it at the federal legislature, your place of work, or deal with it at the states. That's one argument. That's been kind of the prominent originalist argument for the last 30 years. There is another argument, though, which was proposed in a brief to the court on this Dobbs case by John Finnis and Robbie George, the conservative legal scholars, who argue that actually the court does have a right to outlaw abortion, and they can do that because of the 14th Amendment, that the 14th Amendment provides equal protection, and that extends to babies in the womb. I think they make a very compelling argument, actually. They draw on Blackstone's Commentaries, probably the most important treatise on the common law before the American Revolution, and it totally informs our own law here. The 14th Amendment, it's based on the Civil Rights Act of 1866. We can go back to those debates. We can see them invoking Blackstone in these arguments. So anyway, I love their argument. I think it's very convincing.
Invoking the 14th Amendment would be quite ironic, since Roe v. Wade relied on the 14th Amendment as part of its argument as well. So it would just be a real F you.
It would be wonderful. But unfortunately, however, that's not what's going to happen. And so then the battle is going to be in the legislatures. The leader of the Senate, or the future leader of the Senate, I hope, cocaine Mitch McConnell, has said that he's willing to take a look at a national abortion ban. Probably it'll just be fought in the states. No one is mentioning anything about contraception or IVF or Plan B or anything like that. I mean, people are free to make their own. Political communities are free to vote on this. That's why we have democracy. The liberals love to talk about our democracy and our sacred democracy. Well, okay, then how about you trust the people to run their own government? They only trust our democracy when it's convenient for their agenda.
Yeah, and then it gets to a more difficult question because it's easy to say like, look, this is the clear philosophical argument for why this should happen. The politics are another story, and we have to be careful because you go too far, right? You do a national ban on abortion. Let's say we did that. I think pretty soon thereafter, you'd probably end up taking like one step forward, 5 steps back, because I think the backlash would be pretty severe. And so that's going to be a consideration. And each state's going to have to work through that. I personally, I think the Texas law needs to be changed if Roe v. Wade gets overturned, because right now I think it's a very slippery slope, legal, kind of clever, a little too clever of a legal argument. Meaning, it allows you to sue abortion
in Texas.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah.
It gets you past the Roe v. Wade, which is clever. However, if Roe v. Wade gets overturned, we should just have a strict no heartbeat bill, right? Like it should just be a clean bill. That's probably,
you could then. I mean, they've done it in not just in Texas, but other states too. They've had to figure out a way to try to ban abortion in a way that still recognizes the insane legal arguments of not only Roe, but then Planned Parenthood v. Casey, which actually overruled part of Roe. Everyone forgets that, and changed the argument. And so it's such a Rube Goldberg machine based on lies that they'll probably have to go in with a lot of these pro-life laws and say, okay, this is a new ball game, baby, and we're going to have a new law.
It's an interesting time. You mentioned Cocaine Mitch. I actually just did an event in Kentucky last week, and it's what I mentioned. I said, look, like, you can call him a rhino, you could call him establishment, right? Because it's just what our side does. But I don't know. There's fighters, right? And then there's winners. Mitch McConnell does a lot of winning. I think, and he's orchestrated some serious stuff behind the scenes to destroy the Build Back Better plan, for instance. People don't understand like what really happened to give Sinema and Manchin what they needed to vote against that, and just it's not even coming back. Democrats aren't even showing signs that they're going to bring some of it back. This is all Mitch McConnell, right? Like knowing when to take the stand and say Merrick Garland will not come before the Senate until the next president. Knowing when it matters, I think, is so important. And I just, you gotta commend his strategic thinking on this stuff.
I loved McConnell once said something to the effect of the winners of elections go make laws and the losers go home. And there's so much important political truth there that you do have to win. You've got to win and you've got to survive in order to do anything. And I don't know what Mitch McConnell thinks about abortion in his heart of hearts and the deepest recesses of his mind. I don't know, and I don't particularly care. I don't know what Donald Trump thinks about abortion in his heart of hearts or the deepest recesses of his mind. I know what he used to think. He used to think actually what I used to think when I was ignorant on the issue. And then I know that in 2016, he said, no, I'm pro-life now. But here's what I do know. I do know, and call this one of the quirks of providence or history, that on this issue, this pro-life issue, 2 of the most important figures in the entire fight for life could be these extremely imperfect vessels. Mitch McConnell and Donald Trump will have done more if Roe is overruled to inculcate a culture of life and get rid of this awful, stain on American history than almost anybody else. I mean, if that doesn't make you chuckle, I don't know what will.
Well, it's a serious matter, and it should make us pretty happy. Conservatives have done a lot of winning, despite our crappy position in the minority. Again, Build Back Better's dead. You've got Roe v. Wade being overturned. Frankly, the energy question is turning around too. I think the only place we continue to lose very badly is the southern border. And frankly, there's no way to win that until we're in charge. And got to win elections to be in charge, as you noted. Michael Knowles, thanks so much for being on, and look forward to, and everybody should go check out the documentary on dailywire.com.
It's Daily Wire. It's called Choosing Death, The Legacy of Roe. Always good to be with you, Dan. Keep fighting the fight, and maybe I'll see you in DC next time we're out there.
Hey, sounds good. Thanks for coming on.